she screamed. Right there in the middle of the genetics laboratory at the University of Toronto. Not from pain, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. The truth. Dr. Linda Marsh, one of Canada's most respected population geneticists, had just looked at her screen and seen something that should not have been there. Something that broke every model, every assumption, every carefully constructed academic theory she had spent 20 years building. Her coffee went cold. Her colleagues ran in from the hallway. And in that moment, in that sterile white room filled with humming computers and fluorescent lights, the entire story of Canada cracked open like an egg. What she saw on that screen that morning would not just rewrite Canadian history. It would rewrite the history of the entire Northern Hemisphere. But to understand why she screamed, you first need to understand what she was looking for. And more importantly, what she was absolutely certain she would never find. Canada. Just saying the word out loud feels like a breath of cold, clean air. Most people picture maple leaves, hockey, endless forests, and polite people who apologize for everything. The world sees Canada as a young country, a fresh country, a country built by European settlers on empty land. That is the story in the textbooks. That is the story taught to children from Halifax to Vancouver. But here's the problem with that story. It is not wrong exactly. It is just catastrophically incomplete. Because this land, this enormous, breathtaking, frozen and flowering land, was not empty. It was not young. And the people who walk its soil today carry inside their bodies a genetic archive so ancient, so layered, and so shocking that even the scientists who study it sometimes have to sit down and simply stare at the wall. Canada is not a country. Canada is a crossroads. A biological crossroads that has been accumulating human stories for longer than most civilizations have existed. Think about the geography for a moment. This is not a small piece of land tucked into a corner of the world. Canada is the second largest country on Earth by total area. It stretches from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to the Pacific on the west. From the Great Lakes in the south, where the air is warm and the land is rich, all the way north to the Arctic, where the wind cuts like a blade and the ice never truly leaves. It touches 3 oceans. It contains more fresh water than almost any other place on the planet. It is, in geological terms, one of the oldest land masses on Earth. The Canadian Shield, that ancient backbone of rock running through the center of the country, is over 2 billion years old. 2 billion. That is older than complex life itself. And humans have been moving across this land for a very, very long time. But here is where the paradox begins. Here is where the textbook story starts to sweat and tremble. Because when Europeans arrived, the French in the 1500s, the British shortly after, and waves of other settlers following across the centuries, they did not arrive to empty wilderness. They arrived to a land already woven through with thousands of years of human civilization. Civilizations that had their own languages, their own gods, their own trade networks, their own understanding of astronomy and medicine and agriculture. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, what many people know as the Iroquois, had developed one of the most sophisticated systems of democratic governance the ancient world had ever seen. Some historians argue with serious academic evidence that the founding fathers of the United States actually borrowed ideas from the Haudenosaunee political structure when designing the American Constitution. Let that sit for a moment. The democracy that shaped the modern Western world may have roots not in ancient Greece alone, but in the forests of what is now Ontario and New York State. And long before even the Haudenosaunee, there were others. The land we now call Canada has been continuously inhabited for at least 14,000 years. Some recent archaeological discoveries are pushing that number even further back, to perhaps 20,000 years or more. Sites like Bluefish Caves in the Yukon have produced evidence of human presence that shattered previous timelines. And every time scientists think they have found the bottom of the archive, they dig a little deeper and find another layer. This is the first mystery. This is the first thing that should make you lean forward in your chair. Because if people have been here for 20,000 years, and if the genetic signal of all those thousands of years of life, death, love, and migration is still echoing in the DNA of people alive today, then who exactly are Canadians at the deepest biological level? Not the political level, not the cultural level, the blood level. This is the question that Dr. Linda Marsh had been trying to answer for 2 decades. And this is why, on that Tuesday morning in Toronto, when she finally got the results of the largest genomic study ever conducted on Canadian populations, over 47,000 individual samples from across all provinces and territories, she screamed. Because the data showed something that nobody had predicted. Not even close. Let us go back in time. Way back. 12,000 years ago, as the last great ice age was releasing its grip on the northern world, the first humans were moving into what would become Canada. These were not primitive cave dwellers stumbling blindly through the wilderness. These were extraordinarily sophisticated people. They were the descendants of populations that had crossed from northeastern Asia into North America via a land bridge called Beringia, a vast, cold plain that once connected modern-day Siberia to Alaska when sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. These people brought with them a genetic signature that scientists call haplogroup Q. In the male Y chromosome, haplogroup Q is the overwhelming marker of indigenous American ancestry. It is the genetic fingerprint of the first great crossing, the foundational code, the deepest root of the Canadian genetic tree. If you are looking for the original Canadians, the ones whose ancestors arrived first, endured the most, built the earliest civilizations on this land, haplogroup Q is their mark in the biological record. It is the genetic echo of an arrival that happened so long ago that the very shape of the continents was different. And here is where the story gets its first electric shock of conflict. Because when European settlers arrived, beginning in earnest in the 1500s and accelerating through the 16, 17, and 1800s, they did not simply add their genetic material to the existing population. In many devastating cases, they replaced it. Through disease, through warfare, through forced relocation, through policies of cultural extermination so brutal that Canada's own government formally acknowledged them as cultural genocide just a few years ago. The indigenous population of what is now Canada was reduced from millions of people to a fraction of its former size. The genetic river that had been flowing for 12,000 years was not stopped, but it was dramatically narrowed. And then something happened that scientists call elite dominance, a process where a smaller, conquering population imposes its language, its religion, and its culture on a much larger existing population without necessarily replacing the genetics entirely. The blood stays, the name changes, The language disappears. The DNA whispers on. This is the phenomenon that made Dr. Marsh's data so explosive. Because when her team began mapping the genomic landscape of modern Canadians, not just Indigenous communities, but the entire population, French Canadians, English Canadians, Métis communities, recent immigrant populations, they found genetic signals that were hiding in plain sight. Signals that the official story had never accounted for. The French-Canadian population, for example, has long been treated in historical narratives as a relatively closed genetic community. The story goes like this. Settlers arrived from France in the 1600s and 1700s. They were cut off from further immigration after the British conquest of 1760. They reproduced in relative isolation, and modern French Canadians are therefore largely descended from that founding population of a few thousand Norman and Breton settlers. Clean story, simple story, widely believed story. But the DNA does not tell that story. The DNA tells something far more complicated and far more beautiful. Researchers found that a significant percentage of French-Canadian genetic material, in some regional populations as high as 15 to 20%, carries indigenous North American markers that have been invisible in the historical record for centuries. These are not recent admixture events. These are deep genetic contributions going back 4, 5, 6 generations. They represent relationships, marriages, and children that were systematically erased from church records, from family histories, from the official narrative of who French Canadians were supposed to be. Entire family lines that had Indigenous mothers or grandmothers who were recorded in documents simply as anonymous or not recorded at all. The blood remembered what the documents forgot. And it gets stranger. It gets more shocking. Because when the team began analyzing the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child, an unbroken maternal line going back thousands of years. They found haplogroup X. This is where Dr. Marsh's coffee went truly cold. Haplogroup X is one of the rarest and most debated markers in all of human genetics. It is found in indigenous North American populations, yes, but it is also found in a different subtype in populations from the Middle East and Western Eurasia. The debate about what this means has been raging in academic circles for decades. Some researchers argue it represents a very ancient migration route into the Americas that did not come through Beringia, perhaps across the North Atlantic ice shelf during the last glacial maximum, a route so audacious and so dangerous that it sounds more like science fiction than archaeology. Others argue it is simply the result of early contact between Norse explorers and indigenous populations. Contact that is now archaeologically confirmed at the site of L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, where Vikings established a settlement around 1,000 years ago, 5 centuries before Columbus. 5 centuries. The genetic consequence of those contacts, brief as they were historically documented to be, may still be alive in Canadian bodies today. A Norse whisper in a Canadian genome. A drop of ink from 1,000 years ago still visible in the glass of water that is the modern Canadian gene pool. But none of this, not the indigenous foundations, not the hidden French-Canadian ancestry, not the Viking echo, none of this was what made Dr. Marsh scream. She had anticipated finding complexity. She had spent 20 years preparing herself for complexity. What she had not prepared herself for was the discovery that would turn everything upside down completely. A signal so unexpected, so geographically impossible according to every existing model of prehistoric human migration, that 3 separate members of her team independently checked the data 4 times each before anyone said a word out loud. When the room finally went quiet enough for her to speak, she looked at her colleague across the lab bench and said, in a voice that barely came out above a whisper, "This cannot be right." And yet it was. And to understand what she found, you need to understand something about the genetic history of a people who lived not in Canada, not in Europe, not in Asia, but on a chain of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest continent, in a place that most Canadians have never thought about in relation to their own bloodline even once in their entire lives. Because what Dr. Linda Marsh found in that data was a signal from the Pacific. Not a faint whisper, not a statistical noise that could be dismissed with a footnote. A clear, unmistakable genetic signature present in multiple indigenous communities along the western coast of British Columbia and in certain populations of the Canadian interior that had absolutely no business being there according to every existing model of how humans arrived in the Americas. The signal pointed west, across the largest ocean on Earth, and it pointed to a specific place. A cluster of islands in the Central Pacific that geneticists had been studying for a completely different reason, as part of a completely unrelated research project, until the moment that Dr. Marsh picked up the phone and called her colleague Dr. James Napier at the University of Hawaii, and he went very quiet on the other end of the line. And then he said 4 words that changed everything. "We found it too." Now stop for a moment, because you need to understand what this means. The standard model of how humans arrived in the Americas says this: people crossed from northeastern Asia into North America via the Beringia land bridge. They moved south and east over thousands of years. They populated the entire continent from the Arctic to the tip of South America. End of story. No contact from the West. No arrivals from the Pacific. The ocean was a wall, not a road. That was the consensus. That was what the textbook said. That was what Dr. Marsh herself had taught her own students for 2 decades. And now her data was telling her that the wall was not a wall. That somewhere, at some point, someone had crossed it. Someone had made a journey across the open Pacific Ocean so extraordinary, so impossibly dangerous, that even now with modern GPS and satellite weather forecasting and fiberglass hulls and emergency beacons, very few people would attempt it in a small boat. And whoever these people were, they had done it in a canoe. Without instruments, without maps, without any technology that the modern world would recognize as adequate for the task. And they had arrived. And they had met the people who were already here. And something had happened between them. Something that left a biological trace in the DNA of their descendants. A trace that is still there today, thousands of years later. A drop of ink that never fully dissolved. But here is where the conflict gets deeper. Here is where the emotional weight of this story becomes almost unbearable. Because this discovery did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a country that was simultaneously conducting its own painful reckoning with the history of what had been done to the very people whose DNA was carrying this extraordinary secret. Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission had published its final report just a few years before Dr. Marsh's study was completed. The report used the term cultural genocide to describe what the residential school system had done to Indigenous communities, a system that had run for well over a century, a system designed explicitly and officially to, in the words of its own architects, kill the Indian in the child, to erase languages, to sever the connection between generations, to break the transmission of culture and knowledge and identity that had been flowing unbroken for 12,000 years. And here is the unbearable irony, the unbearable, gut-wrenching paradox at the center of this story. While the Canadian government was running a system designed to erase Indigenous identity, the DNA inside the bodies of Indigenous Canadians was quietly, patiently, stubbornly preserving a record of human achievement so extraordinary that it would eventually make scientists in laboratories across the world stop what they were doing and stare at their screens in disbelief. You cannot erase the blood. You can take the language. You can take the children. You can take the land. You can take the name. But you cannot reach inside the cell and change what the chromosome remembers. The genetic archive is the one record that no government policy has ever been able to destroy. And in that archive, written in the haplogroups of people who survived everything that was thrown at them, is the story of one of the greatest feats of human navigation in the history of our species. Now let us talk about what elite dominance really means, because this concept is central to understanding not just Indigenous history in Canada, but the entire genetic story of the Canadian people. Elite dominance is what happens when a smaller, conquering population imposes its language and culture on a much larger existing population, without actually replacing the genetics. The conquering group becomes the political and economic elite. They control the institutions. They control the schools. They control the churches. They control who gets to write history and how it gets written. And over generations, the conquered population begins to speak the language of the conquerors, practice the religion of the conquerors, carry the surnames of the conquerors. From the outside, from the documentary record, from the census forms and the church registers and the court records, it looks like the original population has disappeared. It looks like replacement. But the DNA says something completely different. The DNA says the original population is still there. It is hiding in plain sight, speaking a different language, wearing different clothes, going by different names, but carrying in every cell of its body the unbroken genetic inheritance of everything that came before. This is what happened across enormous regions of Canada. The French settlers who arrived in the 1600s and 1700s did not arrive to empty land. They arrived to a landscape densely populated with sophisticated cultures. And over the following centuries, through a combination of disease and political pressure and cultural absorption, many of those cultures were officially declared to have disappeared. Their descendants were recorded in documents as French, as Catholic, as European. The genetic reality of who those descendants actually were was written out of the official record, erased, forgotten, and then, in laboratories in the 21st century, recovered. Because the DNA kept the secret that the documents tried to bury. And this recovery is happening right now. All across Canada, people are opening envelopes and looking at ancestry results on laptop screens and discovering that the story their families told about themselves for generations is incomplete. A woman in rural Quebec, whose family has been Catholic and French-speaking for 200 years, discovers that 30% of her genetic ancestry traces to indigenous North American populations. A man in New Brunswick, whose family always claimed pure Acadian heritage, finds haplogroup markers associated with Mi'kmaq maternal ancestry going back 8 generations. A family in Ontario that believed itself entirely of Irish Protestant descent discovers an indigenous paternal line that the family tree never recorded. These are not exceptional cases. They are happening by the thousands. They are the private kitchen table version of exactly what Dr. Linda Marsh discovered in her laboratory. The paradox made personal, the blood remembering what the documents forgot. And then there is the question of the Métis, the people who sit at the very center of this genetic paradox. Because the Métis are the community in Canada that never tried to hide the mixing, never pretended to be something they were not. From the very beginning, they said clearly and proudly that they were both, that they were something new, that the meeting of European and indigenous cultures and bloodlines had produced not a dilution of either, but a synthesis of something genuinely original. Their music is neither French nor Cree, but Métis. Their political history is neither European colonial nor indigenous traditional, but something that emerged from the specific conditions of a specific place. Their genetic profile is the most transparent version of what the DNA of millions of other Canadians also shows when the layers of official narrative are peeled back and the biological reality is allowed to speak. The Métis did not hide their paradox. They built a culture on top of it. They made it the foundation of their identity. And in doing so, they showed everyone else what was actually possible when you stop trying to tell a simple story about blood and start paying attention to the complex and beautiful reality of what the genes actually say. But let us go back to Dr. Marsh, because her Pacific discovery did not end with the phone call to Hawaii. It was only the beginning. After confirming with Dr. Napier that his team had independently found the same signal in Polynesian populations that appeared to share genetic material with specific groups on the northwest coast of North America, the two research teams began the painstaking work of trying to date the contact. When had this happened? How many times? Was it a single voyage or multiple contacts over a long period? The genetic evidence suggested a contact event or events occurring somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. Before the Norse arrived at L'Anse aux Meadows, before Columbus, before any contact event that the official historical record acknowledges. A contact so old that the people who made it left no written record, no archaeological trace that anyone has yet identified. Nothing but the faintest whisper of their presence encoded in the chromosomes of their descendants. A genetic echo so ancient and so quiet that it took the most sophisticated sequencing technology in human history to hear it. And when the scientists finally heard it, when they finally understood what they were listening to, some of them sat very quietly for a long time. Because what the data was describing was not just a migration event, it was a human achievement. It was courage on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. It was someone somewhere, 2,000 years ago, looking at the open Pacific Ocean and deciding to keep going, keep going. Just think about those two words for a moment. Keep going. because that is what someone did. 2,000 years ago, in a canoe made from wood and lashed together with plant fiber and sealed with natural resins, someone looked at the horizon where the Pacific Ocean met the sky and saw nothing. No land, no lighthouse, no signal. Nothing but water and wind and the movement of stars above. And they kept going. Not because they had a map, not because they had a radio, not because someone had done it before and come back to tell the story, but because somewhere in the human soul there is a drive that is older than language and older than civilization and older than any genetic marker that science has yet identified. The drive to go further, to find out what is on the other side, to push past the edge of the known world and see what the unknown world looks like when you finally arrive. And they arrived. Somewhere on the coast of what is now British Columbia, a coastline of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary abundance, with its forests of ancient cedar and its rivers choked with salmon and its sheltered inlets teeming with marine life. Someone from across the Pacific set foot on North American soil. Not as a conqueror, not with flags and weapons and declarations of possession, but as a human being arriving at the edge of a new world, exhausted and alive, and carrying in their body a genetic signature that would persist for 2,000 years and eventually be detected by a woman named Linda Marsh, sitting in front of a computer screen in Toronto on a Tuesday morning. And here is what makes this discovery so emotionally devastating, so beautiful, and so painful at the same time. Because the people who carry this ancient Pacific signal in their DNA are the same people whose cultures and languages and ways of life have spent centuries being systematically dismantled by the very civilization that now has the technology to read the record of their extraordinary origins. The geneticists who discovered this signal, with their sequencing machines and their algorithms and their peer-reviewed journals, are the latest inheritors of a Western scientific tradition that was itself part of the colonial project that tried to erase these people. And now that same tradition is handing back to them a piece of their own story. A piece so ancient and so remarkable that it changes the entire frame of the conversation. Not victims of history, not remnants of a dying past, but descendants of the greatest navigators who ever lived. Carriers of a genetic inheritance that connects the Canadian West Coast to the Central Pacific in an arc of human courage that crosses 2,000 years and the largest ocean on Earth. Now let us bring this all together. Because the story of Canada's genetic identity is not one story. It is dozens of stories layered on top of each other, like the geological strata of the Canadian Shield itself. At the very bottom, the deepest layer, the foundation that everything else rests on, is the indigenous genetic inheritance. Haplogroup Q in the Y chromosome, the mark of the first great crossing from Asia into the Americas over the Beringia land bridge, carried by the ancestors of every First Nations, Métis, and Inuit person in Canada. A genetic foundation that is between 12,000 and 20,000 years old. Older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than the wheel, older than written language. This is the bedrock. This is what everything else was built on top of. Then there is the layer of ancient Pacific contact. Faint, but real. The signal that made Dr. Marsh scream and Dr. Napier go quiet on the phone. A layer so old and so thin that it took 21st century technology to detect it. But once detected, impossible to dismiss. Evidence of a human connection across the Pacific that rewrites the story of how isolated the pre-contact Americas actually were. Evidence that the ocean was not always a wall, that sometimes, for the brave and the desperate and the visionary, it was a road. Above that, the layer of Norse contact, confirmed archaeologically at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. A brief but real encounter between the expanding Norse world and the indigenous peoples of the northeastern coast, leaving its own faint genetic whisper in certain populations, a Viking echo in a Canadian genome, a reminder that the story of who came to this land before the official history began is far more complex than any single narrative can contain. Then the European layers, the French arriving in the 1500s and building their settlements along the St. Lawrence, their genetics mixing with indigenous populations in ways that the church records never acknowledged, but that the DNA refuses to conceal. The British following, adding their own lineages, their own haplogroups, their own genetic contributions to the growing mosaic. The Scots who came as fur traders and stayed as husbands and fathers in communities across the Northwest. The Irish who fled the famine of the 1840s and brought their Atlantic genetic inheritance to the cities of Ontario and Quebec. The Ukrainians who came to the prairies in the early 1900s and carved farms out of the grassland and passed their Eastern European haplogroups to children who grew up speaking English but cooking borscht. The Chinese who built the railway and stayed despite the head tax and the exclusion acts and the casual violence of a society that wanted their labor but not their presence. The South Asians who came to British Columbia and faced their own exclusion and stayed anyway and built communities that now stretch across the country. Wave after wave after wave of human migration, each one adding another layer to the genetic archive, each one contributing another thread to the tapestry, each one making the story of who Canadians are more complex and more interesting and more true. And then the modern layer, the immigration waves of the late 20th and early 21st centuries that transformed the genetic landscape of Canadian cities with a speed and completeness that has no historical parallel. Toronto becoming one of the most genetically diverse cities on Earth. Vancouver looking across the Pacific to Asia in its demographics as much as in its geography. Montreal carrying its French foundation, but wearing the genetic contributions of communities from the Caribbean and North Africa and Southeast Asia as naturally as it wears its cobblestone streets. The Canada of today is a genetic experiment of unprecedented scale and unprecedented ambition, a country that decided, as a matter of deliberate policy, to welcome the world.